How has the Brisbane property market changed in the wake of COVID? Can we now count it as one of the big guns alongside Sydney and Melbourne? Or is the recent boom set to be short-lived?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
We're joined this week by Brisbane buyer's agent and REBA Queensland representative Melinda Jennison. Melinda leads Streamline Property Buyers and is possibly the only buyer's agent with a PhD, which means she brings a research lens to strategy development and advice. And we're looking forward to that sort of research lens when we're talking about what's been happening in the Brisbane property market, what makes it tick, and what potentially could be expected for 2023. So thanks so much for joining us, Melinda. We're really looking forward to this chat.
Thanks for having me, Veronica and Chris. It's great to be here, and I'm excited also to share some intel with you.
Absolutely. I think it's quite topical to, get a bit of the Queensland lens right now. It's crazy what happened there in 2020 and 2021. And, I think a lot of people who are living in Sydney and Melbourne, unless you've sort of had friends up there, etc., the craziness in terms of prices, it was a much bigger boom, I think, than Sydney, Melbourne, if you look at it. So it'd be good just to talk through what happened up there in 2020, 2021, and just sort of the craziness in the markets and how that's really shifted in 2022. Just a bit of a story there would be awesome to start us off.
Well, I think like every market around Australia, when COVID first hit, there was so much uncertainty and fear. And I think a lot of buyers really just sat on the sidelines. I know it was the first time in a long time that sales agents were ringing us daily, asking if we still had buyers, because I think also sellers were so nervous about, could they even bring people into their home? So there was definitely 2 or 3 months of what I would call stagnant activity. Everything just fell away. Sellers did not want to sell. They didn't want people through their homes. Buyers really didn't want to consider purchasing property because headlines at that point were saying that we were going to be, falling 40% in value. Now, once the fear subsided, I think that, buyers saw potentially some opportunity to re-engage with the market. Sellers were happy again to open their homes under, strict rules, of course. And we saw this huge buyer surge. Now, I think, no one can explain why that happened, but, in Brisbane, we really saw those buyers trickle back in between August and about October in 2020. And once the news became more positive around COVID, of course, we had fewer lockdowns in Brisbane than the other the other capitals of Sydney and Melbourne. People became far less fearful. And then I think they were really motivated to make those life changes off the back of COVID. And we just saw this huge surge in buyer activity, a market that we probably will never see again. We had low listing volumes throughout that recovery period, throughout that boom period. And yet we had this huge depth of buyers. So for any property that was listed for sale, especially any quality properties, it was not unheard of to have 15 or 20 buyers on an individual property. It was outrageous. So, of course, in Brisbane, not being an auction capital city as such, we actually had a lot of those properties transacting by private treaty sale. And what that meant is that it became a multiple offer process, which is an awful way to buy a property. It's basically blind bidding. You get one go to put a best and final offer in, and then that's your walkaway price. So, because of that, I think buyers had a lot of FOMO. They did not want to miss out. And especially when they were home buyers, they became emotionally connected. Interest rates were, of course, extremely low. So borrowing capacity was increased, and people really were paying top dollar just to actually transact in the market. Now, of course, the thing that slowed Brisbane down was the flood event in February. That was the first big transition period. That really put a handbrake on the buyer sentiment. Following that, we also had the federal election, which we all know, can actually influence buyer behaviour. And of course, we've now had several months of interest rate hikes, which has all had an impact on that buyer sentiment. So the market has definitely slowed down. We don't have that FOMO from buyers anymore, but we are still in a low listing environment in Brisbane. And I think that's what's actually caused prices, not to fall away too much. We've definitely had some median price falls, but again, that's not actually across the board, when we consider, quality properties versus, or rather we consider what's actually selling as opposed to, every property losing value. So it's been an interesting period.
Yeah, your story there is actually, I could say the same thing about Sydney, the same thing about Melbourne, right? That is actually pretty much exactly the same story, except for the flood, of course, although now there's been floods in Sydney and Melbourne as well. But this isn't what's different about Brisbane, I think, and what you haven't touched on yet, and I'm hoping you will, is really the migration of buyers from Sydney and Melbourne in particular, but also I think expats coming back to Brisbane who potentially may not have, if they were going to return to Australia had it not been from COVID, may not have gone to Brisbane perhaps. So I think that has brought a flush of different type of buyers with potentially higher budgets.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to get some insights into that story as well.
Yeah, look, I think throughout a lot of COVID with the state border closures, we didn't see as many interstate buyers transacting unless they were investors. But as soon as those borders reopened, we saw a huge influx of those that were relocating interstate. Of course, some of those interstate migrants had already purchased prior to, those borders opening, had made the decision to relocate prior. But the huge influx really happened when borders reopened. Queensland's had a huge spike in interstate migration. In fact, we're back to our record highs in terms of the volume of people entering Queensland. And most of those interstate migrants land somewhere in southeast Queensland. So that's usually the area from the Sunshine Coast, which is about 1 hour north of Brisbane, right down through to the Gold Coast, about 1 hour south of Brisbane. So as the capital city, most of the migrants land in or around, 1 hour north or south of where we are located. Of course, now that the international borders have also reopened, we've seen a surge in expats returning home. Through our own inquiry, we've had a number of expats purchasing those properties so that they've actually got their home to move back into when they relocate. And a lot of them, because of COVID, purchased with the intent to rent those properties out for so that they're available for when they actually, return home. So buyers have been coming from everywhere. But I will also say that with the borders reopening, that's put a lot of pressure on the rental market as well, which is something that we can discuss in the podcast, because we've got a situation where we've got too many people really relocating to southeast Queensland and not enough properties available to especially to rent, but also in some instances to buy. And that's what really drove a lot of that price growth through the peak of the market throughout the latter parts of 2021.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a friend actually moving to Brisbane like next month, and they live on the beaches, and we're having dinner with them the other week, and a 5 o'clock dinner as you do with two young kids, yeah, they were talking about the rental crisis. Now, like, we're trying to get a place and we've put an application in, we're not looking at them, we're just paying way overs. And it was just like, and it's so difficult. They need to rent something before they move there, but then they can't rent something because they're in Sydney and there's, the locals are actually rocking up and putting a bit of pressure on agents. So I'm like, you've got to get like a rental buyer's agent, almost to help you secure it, because you need that sort of feet on the ground. I think it's a real problem. You might get a great job opportunity, but if you can't rent something, how do you actually move there? From the growth point of view, though, like, we had lots of clients buy in Brisbane. Probably 700 was like the low end, usually 700 up to say $1 million. And most of those properties went up. Like, we're talking, Inner Ring, the Bardens, the Balmorals, Graceville, Wollongabba, a little bit more. So Ascot, when it's more closer to that $1 million. They all went up probably 70 to 90% in the space of under 2 years. Like, it was a huge growth. Like, the 700 went to 1.3, the 1 went to 1.8, like, massive growth. Like, and we didn't see that in Sydney and Melbourne. Like, that's velocity. Is that sort of true at your, those inner ring sort of family suitable sort of bigger blocks went up that much. And how are they coping, with the reduction in borrowing capacity and higher rates? Are these properties giving back a lot of that growth, or are you finding they're really holding value because of low listings?
Look, if we look at, what's happened across all of Greater Brisbane since the start of COVID, our property values at a median level have increased 42.7% from the lowest point prior to COVID all the way through to the peak. Now, that's the housing market. The unit market was a little bit weaker. That went 20.6% across the same period. And now, just in the last few months, we've come back 9.6% in the housing market and 1.7% in the unit market. So overall growth in the housing market up 33% across all of Greater Brisbane. And in the unit market, we're up 28.9% across all of Greater Brisbane. That was through to the end of October 2022. What you've highlighted there, Chris, is what's happened more specifically at a suburb level. And we definitely observed some very strong price growth in certain pockets throughout Brisbane throughout that same period. Of course, median value data in Brisbane, according to CoreLogic, captures over 15,000 square kilometres of geographical location. It's everything in southeast Queensland that's transacting outside of the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. So it's a huge, huge space. And you cannot say what's happening in Ascot and Balmoral and Bulimba, and Barton is the same as what's happening, in some suburbs that might be west of Ipswich or south of Logan or, north of Caboolture. It's just not the same market. There's markets within markets. So, of course, we observed something similar. And, of course, off the back of very low interest rates, affordability skyrocketed for people that were on high incomes, and they were able to borrow much more than what, they can borrow now as interest rates are increasing. So a lot of those people took that opportunity to get into the market to upgrade their homes. And of course, the boom was driven predominantly by home buyers, not by investors. So we saw this huge surge in home buyer activity. So a lot of people did upgrade into what we would consider some of the more blue chip locations across Brisbane. The second part of your question was, has there been any change now that interest rates have started to increase? And of course, that results in a decreased borrowing capacity. And so perhaps what people could afford to borrow or could afford to buy, 8 months ago is very different to what they can afford to buy today. What we're observing is that quality listings in some of the locations that you've identified, that what we would consider blue chip locations, they're just not becoming available. So when they do become available, the demand is still high enough for those properties that we're really not seeing a huge discount. There's no bargains in Brisbane, in those blue chip locations. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand. They'll look at a median value trend and assume that every property that might have transacted 8 months ago is now worth, 9% less if it's a house or whatever. But that's just not the case. And I think a lot of our time is spent educating buyers around true market conditions. It comes down to the demand and the supply for the specific product type, and that ultimately determines whether there's an opportunity to even negotiate or whether you're going to be competing against multiple other buyers in an auction. And therefore, market value is what a buyer's prepared to pay and also what a seller's prepared to let a property go for. And the last point I'll make around that is that a lot of the locations that are blue chip locations are also the areas where we've got a concentration of much higher income earners here in Brisbane. So, of course, rising interest rates don't impact all property buyers and property owners in the same way. People that are on much higher incomes can actually absorb more of that cost. They're typically also suburbs that are dominated by owner-occupiers, not investors. So owner-occupiers, of course, don't up and sell their home at the first sign of distress. They'll cut their discretionary spend, or perhaps they'll not go to Europe this year. Instead, they'll go to Hamilton Island or something that's a little cheaper. But, ultimately, this is the shift we're seeing. And we're certainly not seeing any forced selling across any areas of Brisbane at this time.
So those areas that you're talking about that have had those, huge growth rates are those inner areas. And you could argue that maybe they were a bit undervalued in the first place, and maybe they sort of slightly overshot the mark. But it sounds like that they haven't sort of gone racing ahead and become disproportionate in their pricing. So it's just like a leveling effect, I guess. But it's so interesting hearing you talk, Melinda, because it's like I almost feel like yawning. Oh, this is so boring. We just say the same thing over and over again on this podcast because this is what we're talking about, the fundamentals of a market. And we're talking about the fact that in Brisbane, the same things playing out there that do play out in Sydney and Melbourne. So all of a sudden, I think maybe it is becoming a big grown-up city, not the regional town anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
Because one of the things that has traditionally capped the Brisbane market is at that upper end in particular has been that sort of lack of the high-paying jobs. But I guess with remote work, I'm wondering whether that is to be seen as more of a permanent shift in Brisbane, that cap has been taken away. I mean, is that what you're observing, or is there a bit of a U-turn back to Sydney and Melbourne for some of those higher paying, or even overseas for that matter, now that lockdowns are a thing of the past and people can go back to their higher paying jobs in the head offices of some of our major corporations?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, I think that there was a real shift to work from home. A lot of people took that opportunity to relocate to where they wanted to live, assuming that, we'd be working from home for a lot longer. But the reality is that a lot of big businesses are, asking people to come back into offices. Look, anecdotally, we have not observed a lot of people relocating to Brisbane that are looking to turn around and go back to the big cities of Sydney and Melbourne. However, through conversations with colleagues and peers, some that perhaps have relocated to coastal areas such as the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast, we have heard that there has been a shift back to some of the capital city markets simply because of that requirement for their employers to have them back into the office. Even Brisbane, commuting from Brisbane to Sydney for a one-day event, you jump on a plane, you're there within an hour. It's actually not.
Has it changed?
Sorry. So, by the time you actually get to the airport, it's probably a 2 to 2.5 hour round trip from door to door, wherever you need to be. The plane trip itself is an hour, but yes, with wait times and boarding times, and perhaps we should factor in delays. But a lot of people are prepared to do that if they don't ever if they're only required in the office 2 or 3 days a week. But let's not forget the huge economic and infrastructure development that is happening here throughout southeast Queensland. And with a lot of that is coming a lot more job opportunities. And, a lot of those jobs will be those high-paying jobs. So the opportunities for a career advancement in locations throughout southeast Queensland is continuing to increase as our city does grow up. And I think that a lot of people have always assumed that Brisbane is a little, country town, and we certainly have been, known for that. But, with our population projections and also the accessibility to other nations around the world, especially with the opening of our second runway at our international airport, we're actually becoming a place on the map as a city. And, there's a lot going on in Brisbane. And I think when we look back 10 years from now and consider what Brisbane will be like 10 years into the future, I think we'll be talking about a very different capital city market.
Well, I mean, you do have the benefit of the big rings coming to the city in 10 years, right? The Olympics. And I think that's put you on the global map, an Olympics would. But do you find that my attitude with people buying Brisbane was to buy something up there that new money would want, right? So people moving back from overseas, obviously, but also people who had to escape Sydney and Melbourne, housing affordability. They wouldn't usually move there from Melbourne, actually, very patriotic, the Victorians, but that shifted in COVID. And, so what would a Sydney family who can't afford in Sydney, what would they want in Brisbane, right? And why would they move to Brisbane? Because of affordability. But, I also thought that maybe a lot of people in the inner ring of Brisbane with flexibility would move, the money would flow out to the Sunshine Coast and would flow out to the Gold Coast. Do you find that not many people are actually doing, let's say that high income couple and family, even though COVID happened, even though you could work from home, the return to work in the office still keeps them around the inner city locations. They don't, unless they may be running their own business or something, a lot of the income stuck there. They don't, even though they could commute from the Gold Coast, they don't do that. They still stay in the city.
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that whilst we talk about the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast being only an hour from Brisbane, that's, on a Sunday at midday without traffic. If you're commuting from the coastal regions into the capital city of Brisbane, the reality is during peak hour, it's a nightmare and the roads are congested.
Yep.
And we don't really have efficient public transport networks to get people quickly from the Gold Coast to Brisbane nor from the Sunshine Coast to Brisbane. Yep. There's a train network that services both regions. However, It's not yet a fast train. Now, Brisbane recently has announced that we have won this city deal, which is meant to fast track redevelopment throughout the entire southeast Queensland region. And proposed with that city deal is fast train access from the Gold Coast to Brisbane and then all the way through to the Sunshine Coast. Now, we've not yet seen any finalisation of funding towards those projects, so it's still an idea at this stage, but it's not yet planned and confirmed. I think once we do have more efficient transportation systems through the infrastructure that's yet to come, we will see a change or a shift potentially to some locations that might be providing more of those lifestyle options that people love. And a lot of people do relocate to Brisbane for the lifestyle. We are a little bit more laid back, but obviously if people want that coastal lifestyle, they do need to move either to the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast, because we're a river city. We're not a beach city in Brisbane. And even bayside locations in Brisbane, they're not the same as bayside locations in the likes of Sydney and Melbourne. And I think a lot of people from down south don't realise the difference, and they feel that just because something might be bayside or have bay in its name, that it actually is a desirable location. It's not always the case, and we're always very mindful of educating Southerners around what makes a location desirable here in Brisbane.
It's such a good point, actually. And we've had this conversation with Kent Lardner many times on the podcast when we've gone through various data and expose of various locations. And some of the places, is there a Wentworth? I'll try to think of it. No, okay, I'll just try not to think of the names, Veronica, but
there's a Wynnum, which is the W Bayside location.
But there's been some of those Bayside locations that we've discussed as being not great performers over time. And a lot of it is when you look at the type of buyer that might go there, might be attracted to it versus the locals. And once they get there, they discover why the locals aren't attracted to it. And I think this is a really good principle for anybody relocating, not to apply the thinking from where you come from to the thinking where you're going to. What are some of the things, we're sort of going slightly off piece here, but what are some of the silly things? I mean, we're going to ask you for a Dumbo later, but I'm curious as to some of the mistakes that the people moving to Brisbane would make, some obvious mistakes.
I think the obvious mistakes, as you pointed out, is applying principles from Sydney and Melbourne or other capital city markets and assuming that they apply equally to Brisbane. It's simply not the case. I think the biggest thing with Brisbane, there's probably two biggest things. One, we're built on a floodplain, so people must be aware that elevation in Brisbane is critical. And if you're not checking flood maps as a property buyer, then, that's a big mistake. The second thing is that Brisbane is a young but rapidly growing city. So whilst Sydney and Melbourne have had a lot of their infill development already take place, Brisbane is still undergoing that gentrification phase, and there's a lot of locations that are zoned for redevelopment but not yet redeveloped. So just because you're buying into a neighbourhood doesn't guarantee that neighbourhood will look the same 10 years from now. You must understand the pockets where there's an earmark or there's a plan for higher density development, because you don't really want to be impacted by that in the future.
I think that the floodplains, I think everyone listening to this with Brisbane, they've heard of floods. They know about it. Some obviously still buy without looking at the maps, I'm sure, like people buy without building a pest. The second point I think is absolutely a key one. I think as soon as I ask client, what's your properties? Where are they? Okay, they're in Brisbane. What is it? House, townhouse, apartment? As soon as they say house, townhouse or apartment, I go, uh-oh. And that leads into that second point, right? Like it's literally, there's no cap on those things. And, with townhouses across the middle rings of Brisbane, you got a lot of those big 800 splitter blocks and they can build them for fun. And I don't think there's ever really going to be a shortage of townhouses on any, investment cycles.
Look, in relation to townhouses, Brisbane City Council recently, about 4 years ago, proposed a change in the city plan. It was called Brisbane's Future Blueprint, and it actually prevented a lot of land that was previously available to be developed into townhouses. It prevented the change of use to be constructed as townhouses. And what that's meant is anything within the Brisbane City Council region, it's become harder to actually build profitable townhouse developments. The other thing that changed with that blueprint or that change in the city plan was that the requirement for an increased ratio of car parks to every development meant that developers couldn't feasibly build 3 townhouses on a 607 square metre block where previously they could. So because of that, we've actually seen a shortage or a shrinking in the supply of new townhouses within the Brisbane City Council region.
Yep.
It's not the same in other council regions, including Moreton, Ipswich and Logan.
Can we do a little bit of a map thing? You know, we're not visual here, but because Brisbane City Council is enormous, isn't it? It covers, is it 9 different sort of areas or something? I mean, it's not like in Sydney where you've got a number of within a 10K radius of the Sydney CBD, I don't know off the top of my head, but there's a number of different councils. Brisbane, you got one council that covers how many suburbs? Or what sort of, I'm sure you can do this on the top of your head.
Actually, it's a good question. I don't know the number of suburbs, but Brisbane City Council is the largest city council region across all of Australia. So geographically, it's the largest in terms of the square kilometres covered. But you can be in the Brisbane City Council region and still be 20 kilometres to the north of the CBD or 17 kilometres south of the CBD. So it's a huge geographical area. Then to the north of the Brisbane City Council region is the Moreton Bay region.
Yeah.
Now that actually covers everything from about Strathpine or Petrie all the way up to north of Caboolture. So again, a really large council region. And in fact, one of the fastest growing regions in terms of population growth across all of Australia. To the west, we've got the Ipswich City Council region. Now that obviously captures a huge area and it's a development pipeline. And when we talk about growth areas, we talk again about population growth. There's a lot of new land subdivisions and new developments going on out in that pocket. And then the Logan region is from the south of Brisbane City Council all the way down to the top end of the Gold Coast. Again, a very high growth region, and growth not being capital growth, growth being population growth, and a lot of new land subdivisions happening there as well. And then Redlands is out to the east.
So there's a development growth versus capital growth. And it's interesting how over the years you've seen a lot of marketing from developers in particular, real estate agents talking about the growth corridors. And I think that a lot of investors from southern states haven't necessarily realised the distinction between the two different types of growth. But I think that Brisbane is quite unique in the size of its council. It's certainly its inner, Brisbane City Council. It's very unique, and I think a lot of people probably don't realise that. And I think another thing that a lot of Southerners don't realise when they're buying there is that vendor disclosure, in particular, say in New South Wales and Victoria, is relatively high. I still don't think it's enough, but hey, that's just because I'm a buyer's agent, It's relatively high in terms of what a vendor has to provide to a purchaser, whereas in Queensland, when I was, researching Home Buyer Academy, our course there with Megan Wells, I was absolutely blown away with the limited amount, almost nothing, that a vendor is required to provide to a buyer. And I don't understand how anybody, not only interstate, migrants, but a local, I don't understand how anybody buys up there without a buyer's agent. And I'm not trying to toot the buyer's agent trumpet here. This is purely because if nothing is disclosed, and you don't know what you don't know, you haven't got the faintest clue of where to start looking to make sure you've covered off the due diligence you need when you're buying a property. So it's a fascinating market from that point of view.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers. And if you'd like a 30% discount plus free postage for my book Auction Ready, How to Buy Property Even Though You're Scared Shitless, and yes, I'm a potty mouth, use the code ELEPHANT at the checkout. veronicamorgan.com.au.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
It certainly is. And I think, when we hear the media headlines that, property prices are plummeting, we're down 10%, and buyers assume that they can go into a purchase, assuming that the property market's plummeted, having no idea of the comparable sales of the properties that we would typically be looking at to determine value or appraise a property. It is one of the biggest frustrations for buyers here in Brisbane. It's one of the primary reasons that people would reach out to a buyer's agent. In an auction campaign, there is no price guide given. The property is listed on the real estate portals. There is no dollar amount listed. Agents cannot give advice around value. So you are going in blind as a buyer, and unless you have an understanding of the most recent comparable sales, you're really throwing a dart, at a wall and hoping to hit a target. The other thing is that when it is a private treaty sale, it's very rare for an agent to list a price with the listing. Some buyers have worked out how to determine the filters that agents might use in the back end of some of the listing portals like realestate.com or Domain. But I will say that that's not always an accurate indication of where the property's value is as well. And we've certainly seen some agents list properties in lower price filters to generate more interest. A lot more buyers then turn up. They're hopeful buyers. They think that they've got a chance that might result in 10 registered bidders, and it makes a sales agent look fantastic when they can say to the vendor that they've got all of this interest. But the reality is the first bid knocks out 80% of those buyers because they don't really understand the true value based on comparable sales. But a tip for buyers, if they are shopping in Brisbane or, in Queensland with the rules around, buying property here, is to ask the sales agent to provide a list of comparable sales to you as a buyer so that you've actually got an understanding how they might be positioning that property with their vendor, because any good sales agent should be able to provide that list of comparable sales for you, and that will help you to understand what they're looking at. But I will say also, as another tip, that not all relevant comparable sales will be on the sales agent's list either. Some of those will be those that have done very well with recent sales, and perhaps those that haven't achieved a price that is as attractive. They won't be on that sales agent's list.
So, Melinda, what are those things that Sydney, Melbourne buyers potentially overlook or maybe underweight a property around aspects? So, when I'm chatting to a client in Melbourne, I sort of really bang home the importance of a good aspect, right? Winters are pretty cold down there, and, not getting any winter sun into the property and having a north rear or even a west rear, or at least get some light in, is really important. I'd say in Sydney it's not as important. I mean, it's still definitely preferable. But in Brisbane, though, what's your sort of view on the aspect up there, because it can get super hot and, is it really that the property and what's around the property, you do a lot more thinking into that rather than typically just looking at the map and saying, right, that's good aspect, let's move on?
Aspect is really important for buyers to consider, and the most desirable aspect in Brisbane is for your entertaining area to face the northeast. That's where we get our bayside breezes coming through the city. However, I will say that aspect to some extent is dependent on the mountains, the
topography,
the hills, the topography around you. So, a lot of people really dislike a west orientation. Our hot western sun in the middle of summer is very unpleasant. We like to live out on our decks, in our alfresco areas, but you really can't be sitting out, at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a hot summer's day if you're sitting out in that westerly sun. So that's probably the least desirable location. However, facing the west, if you're shaded by the mountains in areas such as Barton, where you are over in the western suburbs, then you might not be impacted. So we don't always rule a property out purely based on the orientation. It also depends on any shading that comes from the surrounding areas.
And what about the south facing?
Yeah, but so shading can be a total killer.
Yeah.
Let's see.
It can be too. And south-facing, south-facing when you're on the north side of Brisbane is quite a desirable orientation if you're going to actually pick up some of the city views that come with that orientation. So, south-facing is not undesirable. It's definitely cooler in winter and warmer in summer, but south-facing, as long as you're protecting the west, is actually not too bad. North-south-facing is actually the most desirable orientation.
One of the things around the quoting, just to go back to that for a moment, I always find it fascinating when I look to some of the legislation in Queensland around property. And we've had, just a blanket ban, it's legislated, agents cannot give price guides. Does that really help buyers? You could argue yes, you could argue no, right? I sort of argue no. On the another thing, at the beginning of COVID, so when, lockdowns, and then there was that legislation that was really quite punitive towards landlords. And so there was an industry uprising to get that quashed, right? Get that changed. Then more recently, there was legislation around land tax for investors and a lot of pressure there to be changed as well. Also, there was some publicity around the state government. Queensland state government held a roundtable or a forum on the property industry, on the property market, and key players were not brought to the table, even though it's a well publicised rental shortage. There weren't representatives from groups representing property investors, for example. Now, it seems to be that the government is a little deaf when it comes to the property industry. They totally disregard what we have to say, and that it's only when they get sufficient pressure that they will listen. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Look, without getting political, it's been a tough couple of years, especially for property investors here in Queensland. And we know based on the most recent survey completed by PIPA, Property Investment Professionals of Australia, that about 30% of investors have left the Queensland market in the last 2 years. And of course, that's contributed to the current supply shortage and the current rental crisis. And perhaps with the Queensland government, I know that the proposal that they put forward and in fact legislated in relation to the land tax changes is something that almost slipped through the back door. And once it became known, it was legislated for more than 6 months before the media really got hold of it.
Wow.
And it was only after the industry voice actually stood up to oppose it and really outlined what the consequences would be to the tenant and the mum and dad that need somewhere to live. A lot of people assume that landlords are very greedy and that they'll just put their rents up to cover the increased costs. The reality is that rents are not actually driven by the costs of the investor that owns the property. Rents are driven by supply and demand. And when you've got a shrinking supply of available rental properties in a given market, as evidenced by a number of property investors leaving the market and a lot of those home buyers entering the market throughout the last couple of years during the boom that we've had, it's just resulted in fewer properties available for rent. At the same time, we've talked about this huge influx of migrants coming from both interstate and overseas, as well as locals just looking to move and relocate. There's a lot of people looking for rental properties, and that is what is pushing rents up in Brisbane.
But wasn't the theory around the land tax not so much to help with rents, but to supposedly help first home buyers and say, well, look, all those evil investors are taking properties from the hands of first home buyers. And it's naive in the extreme from where I'm sitting. As much as I want to help first home buyers, that's not the solution.
Well, it's the same thing
certainly
as when,
not the solution. And
when the Australian government changed the rules around expats, they said, look, if you don't sell your property by this date, you're going to pay CGT from the moment you purchased it. So someone bought a property in the 90s or early 2000s, they moved to London. It's been a rental property here for the rental market, right, which is great. They haven't sold it because they may move back to Australia and it's property for them, or it's just and then all of a sudden, if you don't sell it by this date, then you have to pay capital gains tax on that, even though you might have lived in it for 15 years before you went. It was a crazy policy, but it went through. And COVID stopped a lot of people selling those properties because of the date. I think it finished in June 2020. But then we've got lots of clients who are expats who are overseas. They've got properties, and we've got to look at their capital gains tax. And we're like, that's 150 or that's 250 grand of capital gains tax because it's at the top marginal rate, no discounts, and since they purchased it. So the irony was that policy was there to support the property market by giving more listings for people living locally to buy. But what it's done is it's forced people who have got properties and are living overseas to not sell. And it did the opposite of what the policy was trying to do, because a lot of people couldn't get their property ready for sale in that period, and then they just went, I'm not going to sell it now. So if anything, it's restricted supply. So the irony of government policy, it happens. The effects can be really long lasting, because a lot of these expats now are not listing their properties, or they're coming home to sell and then they're holding off.
Absolutely. I think any retrospective policy brought in by any government, it's not necessarily always well thought out. And without industry consultation, you know, let's face it, when we're in the industry, we really understand what drives property markets. However, anyone that doesn't understand those fundamental dynamics of, supply and demand may assume that, small policy changes don't have big impacts. Yes, the Housing Summit was held in October here in Queensland and some of the key stakeholders weren't brought to the table, but clearly the land tax has been withdrawn. It's no longer going to be legislated. So thankfully, we're not going to see that impact. And of course, it was brought in to penalise all of those very greedy interstate investors, according to the Queensland government, who are very wealthy and own property outside of Queensland. But the reality is it wasn't a very well thought out tax at all.
Well, just on that too, because really, I'm obviously based in Sydney and certainly it seemed to me over the past decade or so that the type of investor that goes to Brisbane to invest in Brisbane is chasing affordability. And so therefore they're not necessarily the big fat cats that you might expect them to be. And I think that's, one of the sting in the tail for a lot of those investors that they've got their affordable 2-bedroom unit for the price of a 1-bedroom unit in Sydney, for argument's sake, but did they get any capital growth out of that? And so, there's been a lot of development that has been targeted directly at those interstate investors, and they haven't necessarily done that well out of them, in terms of capital growth. And look, I remember times when we were filming actually up there, and there were big billboards offering 3 months rent free and a free iPad to tenants. So it's not like the rentals were really strong for all that time either. So how are you seeing that sort of investment side of the market? And is there any let up in the unit? I mean, we talked about the potential for ongoing development in the unit space. How is that looking?
Yeah, look, we had a significant change in our city plan in the Brisbane City Council region in 2014, and that resulted in a lot of previously industrial zone land being earmarked for high density development. Now, by 2016, we had that many cranes in the skyline of Brisbane City, and we had a huge influx of developers that built high density inner city units, and they were specifically targeting the investor market. So at that time, overseas investment was easy. We had a lot of interstate investors, as you pointed out, people just looking to get an affordable piece of Brisbane. But the fundamentals at that time were really bad because there was an oversupply, and there weren't enough buyers to absorb the amount of property that was actually being developed. So as a result of that, we saw price falls. A lot of people that had bought off the plan, they couldn't even settle. The property was worth less than at the time of completion than when that originally purchased. But also, we saw rents decrease, and that not only impacted that inner city unit market, but the surrounding housing market. Because again, for renters, they'll look at, I've got $400 per week to spend on rent. Do I want to live in an old house that might be 3 kilometres from the CBD, a little bit run down for that price perhaps, or do I want to go and get my rental incentive from the developer where I get 6 months rent free? And then I've got a further 18 months locked in at this price. And that's what we were seeing. So vacancy rates actually spiked between 2016 and for a number of years after that. And also rents declined in both the unit market and the housing market. Now, off the back of a number of different changes, we've seen the development pipeline really dry up. So whilst I mentioned there's a lot of land that's currently available that's yet to be developed, the reality is those developments at the moment in Brisbane are not feasible. So we've had a lot of increasing costs for developers. Obviously, interest rates are going up, so holding costs are increasing. Construction costs are going up. So, the overall feasibility is slimming. And then, of course, when you've got market sentiment that's falling because buyers are less confident, it's very hard to get those off-the-plan sales. So therefore, developers actually can't get projects out of the ground. So we've got developments that may be approved, but not, unable to be commenced. And as a result, in the foreseeable future, we don't actually have a lot of supply that's going to be coming. It's important, though, for buyers to understand that at some stage the tap will be turned back on, and therefore understanding where those pockets of supply are is critical. It's not going to impact the whole market in the same way, but it will impact those locations that are close by. So that's where, you know, an understanding of those future pockets of supply is really critical.
I think we've seen a lot of investors come to us, you know, pre the sort of stabilisation in prices in the last couple of years, and they know they bought a bit of a dud. You know, they know they shouldn't have bought an apartment in Brisbane, for example, but they got sold the off-the-plan dream by somebody, and like Veronica was saying, they went for affordability. It was, you know, servicing itself, positive cash flow, but they've seen that it's had no growth, and they've seen what's happened in the Sydney, Melbourne market where they, you know, potentially if they just upgraded their home and they've, you know, that pain, as soon as prices recovered, a lot of them have taken their money and have probably sold to first home buyers up there, you know, not other investors, you know, like, and that's created more rental issues because it's less properties for rent. But we also saw this, I'm not saying this is your business at all, Melinda, but there's some buyers agencies out there that really proliferate this quantity strategy, right? And they do it up in Southeast Queensland. So they do it in, and we don't work with any of these businesses, but we see the clients after they've been to them for a number of years and they come to us and their portfolio is a mess, right? And, you know, they've got properties in Red Bank Plains and up near sort of starts with K, up near in the Moreton Bay, Kalinga, and Logan.
Kalinga.
Yeah. And so, and they've got 5 of them. And what's surprising, in COVID, they went through the roof. Like, they didn't go up anywhere near as much as, you know, the inner rings, you know, the Balmorals and the Bardens, etc. They all went up like 70, 80, 100%, right? But these areas went up, you know, a good 50, 60%. You know, they went from 400 to 600. And a lot of the investors are sort of, in those markets, there's already a lot of investors. And my worry is in those markets, have you seen any signs that there's investors running away, but the home buyers, the affordability market that generally were buying those under 2% interest rates are saying, well, I can't afford that under 6% or 5% interest rates. Plus you're getting more investors running for the hills trying to take their money. So even though you're seeing low listings across Brisbane, in these sort of investor hotspots where you've got investors running for the hills just because they're trying to take their money off the table, they know they're not great long-term assets now, they've switched on. And the people who ultimately are their buyers, young first-home families, can't afford those properties under higher prices and higher rates. Have you seen any kind of decent declines, or is it still low listings in those areas from what you know?
It's a good question. And I think we can only look at median value trends to get an understanding of what's happening in certain segments of the market. But that said, you know, when we talk about the top end of the market, we've already talked about those blue chip locations. They're really not seeing price falls because there's still strong demand. When you're looking at locations where the demographic group are predominantly maybe low-income earners, and you're right, there's an affordability cap in terms of what they can afford to pay to buy a property, but there's also an affordability cap in terms of what they can afford to rent a property. So a lot of these locations that you've referenced may be, you know, locations where you've got 60 or 70% of the demographic group are actually property investors. Now, in my opinion, those locations are high risk locations because in a boom market, of course, you're going to see high growth and you know, strong upside across all of property markets. The concern is that there's a lot of people that are leveraging a marketing message off the back of what's happened in the last 2 years. What's happened in the last 2 years is abnormal. That's not normal. And, you know, when I see high growth, high yield or high growth, high income properties, I think, well, for which 1 year period or for which 2 year period are you talking about? When we're looking at suburbs and locations for our clients, especially our investor clients, it's important for them to understand what's happened in the last 20 years across those locations in terms of growth, or the last 10 years, not just the last 2 years, because that tells a story of, you know, the long-term trends in a particular location. And what you'll find is there's very little correlation between the 2-year growth and the 10 or 20-year growth in some of the locations that you're referencing. So I think it's absolutely critical for buyers to keep their blinkers on and really ask questions if you're getting this advice, you know, understand, well, one, who's giving the advice, 2, have they been in the market over multiple property cycles, or are they just referencing the one and only property cycle over the last 10 years where interest rates did nothing but decrease? Because I think when you're assessing property over multiple property cycles and considering what happens in different interest rate environments, you're really looking at different pressures for different population groups. And I can guarantee you what's happening in terms of the buyer demand in locations where there's high income groups versus locations where there's low income groups. It's very different across areas of Brisbane.
What you're talking about there, a number of things popped into my mind. One is the aspirational markets. And so, in the higher income areas, that is where people aspire to be. So you've always got a queue of people that if they can get to the point where they can afford it, and that might be if there's a price fall, for argument's sake, or a perceived price fall, they think that's great, now I can afford to buy there. So you got that. The other thing too is the scarcity thing. So a lot of those growth corridors where those 60-70% of investor held, there's not a huge scarcity of stock. It's, house and land packages or those dual key entry townhouses, all that sort of stuff. But then there's that, the type of buyer's agent, the type of spruiker, and they're all out there that are going on 1 or 2 years of data. And I love that. It's like, yep, everything's gone up, you idiots. But do they compare how much that went up to something else? There's no relativity or benchmarking that goes on. And I 100% agree with you. I've been spending a little bit of time in YouTube lately. It's a scary world there with all these people that are very clever, very slick, very articulate and smart. And what they're doing, they're sort of creating an audience. They're generating an audience for all their clever videos and all the rest of it. And then they're selling this dream. And I'm like, this is the same shit that we saw back in 2010, 2012.
15.
To say it was slightly different shovel, because back then it was around mining towns, But all the people that basically piled in with this false logic with a bunch of experts that really were only talking about one cycle and really poor fundamentals when it comes to investing. And I'm seeing a whole new generation. It's this very similar message, slightly different location. And I'm horrified, actually. And the big part of that is this focus on very, very recent data.
Yeah.
And I think also the focus on the fact that a lot of these investors have purchased these types of properties in the lowest interest rate environment on record. And the scary thing is, how will these properties perform as interest rates stabilise or continue to increase over time? Because a lot of the sell was buy-in for high yields, high cash flows. Well, of course, with rising interest rates, those cash flows get dried up because of the increasing costs of holding. Now, if you're not going to get those high incomes and now you're not getting growth, or in fact, you might actually get a reduction or a decline in the value, then you're left with negative equity and holding costs, which is never a good position to be in. And I think it comes down to understanding, when you are buying a property, understanding the purpose behind the purchase. Are you looking for income now, or are you looking for long-term wealth creation? And there is a difference, and it comes down to what you need as an individual based on your personal circumstances. And it's never a one-size-fits-all approach. So if you're working with someone that only sells a strategy, then you're working with the wrong person, because you really need to be talking to people that can help you understand based on your circumstances what approach is right for you based on what you're trying to achieve. And it's never, ever a one-size-fits-all in property.
That's exactly the point here. That's why we go nowhere near these type of buyer's agents as well, is that no matter what that income that person's earning, no matter how much equity they've got, no matter what their plans are with their life, etc., their strategy is just to buy as many as possible, right? And so, the person who could buy, $2 or $3 million of properties end up just buying 7 of their properties, right? Not just the person who's buying one. It's just literally just rinse and repeat. And it's easy to buy in these markets for them as buyer's agents, so they can clock up lots of transactions because they're not competing with lots of high-income family buyers and very lack of scarcity, etc. So it's a really big point. Can we finish with a property Dumbo, Melinda? I'm sure you've got one for us. What have you got?
Yes, look, when I was managing a small development a number of years ago, I had to approach a neighbour over a dividing fence. And this was a young couple with a new baby that had just purchased their dream home. So I knocked on their door and I explained who I was, and we were about to commence a redevelopment on the site next door. So I was talking to her about what we were planning and the fact that we had a fence that needed to be reconstructed. And she actually got very upset and said to me, I had no idea that you were about to build 3 townhouses. I had no idea that people were going to be looking into my yard. This is my dream home. And so my Dumbo is, you really need to understand the neighbourhood, not just the house, and you really need to understand what the neighbourhood will look like in the future, because if you are buying a dream home, you don't want to be negatively impacted by development that may be about to commence around you.
Oh,
It's a very good Dumbo. It's very easy to sort out too, even in Brisbane. Like the Brisbane City Council website has some incredible wealth of information for property buyers, and you can find this stuff out.
The sad thing is most people don't know what they don't know.
I think it's just so important to just spend a lot of time around your property, easily you can rock up on a busy Saturday, right? And you get in and out of the property, you fall in love with the property, and you don't really spend the time looking at the neighbours and the ones behind, and they're too long from your neighbours and what's happening over there and what's up. Especially a lot of people are out of area buyers. Not everyone's buying the suburb they've always lived in. You're because you live where you want to live, and then all of a sudden your budget forces you to go explore new areas, and people haven't got the ability of time to. FOMO kicks in. I'm not going to go rent there for a year, right? And so a lot of people are taking a leap of faith in new suburbs and don't know what the locals in that suburb knows. And yeah, I just think it's so key, right? Like that's an older house. It probably at some point needs to get knocked down. How long have they been living there? 30 years. Okay, well, it's a risk, right? It's a risk that, when they pass on or go to aged care home or something like that, a young family's going to come in and demolish. And would they build townhouses? Well, maybe it's feasible for that. Would we be okay with that? So I think a lot of people don't have that thinking of what's going to change around them. We had a client literally tried to buy a property yesterday. We stopped them. They said, we're going to make an offer on this place. Do you mind providing the address? And we looked at it, and literally straight away, I was like, that's a deal breaker. It's backing on to, not on the main road, but they're one street away, and their property is kind of industrial over the back fence. And then four doors up, there's like a 5 level apartment block. So I'm like, have we just gone, and I can see it on Street View, just go on Street View, and I screenshotted it. That could be overlooking your back fence in a couple of years' time. And they're like, oh, we didn't think of that. And so
thinking about your exit strategy, who's going to buy the property if you have to sell?
Yeah.
And taking that defensive position, I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to have a property that appeals to the largest segment of the market, then I'd be questioning, the motivation behind the purchase.
yeah.
That's a fundamental of capital growth, that one.
Awesome. That's such a good chat, Melinda.
Great chat.
And it'd be awesome to have a chat maybe in a year or two, because I think that what you point around those properties, I think they're the ones who are really going to struggle. If rates stay high, we start getting people can't refinance because of lower borrowing capacities. People are coming off fixed rates, and a lot of these investors fixed. A lot of people can't extend interest-only terms, and their cash flow gets tight. Then rents aren't going up, or you start to see because a lot of investors have to bail, and then there's if that is a perfect storm. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if rates stay high and things play out over the next few years, it could happen. So we'll wait and see.
The issue is that median data trend might show something different to Greater Brisbane. This is happening here, but this is happening here, and that's why I just really dislike median data and how much fear that can create in a market, because media can swing a market one way or another.
Awesome.
And what we're seeing here is very different to what we might be seeing over here. So it's just we're all about sharing facts and information, not generating fear.
Yeah,
Bring it
awesome.
on.
Thanks, Melinda. Talk soon.
Thank you.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.